All right, welcome to another episode of Getting Started.Life, the show where we help you launch new endeavors and try new things. Today, we're talking about living off the grid. We have a great guest, Richard Gray, and very interesting background. I wanna introduce him a little bit, but no one can introduce him better than himself. Uh, Richard Gray is for his job right now, loss prevention, but started out trying to live off grid and had a less than favorable experience. And I love that because part of our show is about making mistakes, learning about it, and going on. So Richard, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into kind of living off the grid.
Um, well, I was living in of all places, Atlanta, and wanted to get out of the rat race. So just decided to go headfirst into it. Bought a little patch of land in the Ozark Mountains in Arkansas, and didn't really work out the first time. So we're trying it again.
Wait, I got to ask one thing before you go on. You live in Georgia right now, right?
No, I actually live in Missouri.
Oh, okay, got it. Because you spent some time you were in Atlanta for a while.
Right.
I was gonna say, are you happy about the outcome of that game last night?
Oh, I'm not a sports guy.
Oh,
I
really?
couldn't even
It was a
I
great
couldn't
game.
even
It
tell
was
you
a great game.
I couldn't even
Uh,
tell you
I'm not a
what
huge sports nut either, but it was a good game to
It
watch.
was a good game. It was a
Okay.
good game. So, father of three. I love the term rewilded. You sent us your bio. You said you are a rewilded father of three. And being just a father of three, you said you had young kids. That's wild in and of itself.
Right.
But talk a little bit about what real wilded is and how it got you into living off the grid.
Well, so we lived in some big urban areas like New Orleans for a while. We lived in Atlanta. We lived in Tampa, and we just kind of wanted to get back to our roots. We were originally from Arkansas, and that was kind of calling to us. So um, we just wanted to get out of that rat race, and we made the move, and um, don't regret it at all.
So your wife sounds like she's behind it, right? So based on what
Oh,
you told me, you bought like 20
100%.
acres of land in
Hmm.
the Ozarks. How was that conversation? She was behind it to begin with, right? Did she
From
come
the
from a background similar to yours that had, you know, that skill set, right? Like something you were getting back to as opposed to something new.
Yeah, she was basically it her she was born in St. Louis, but it turns out that her dad came from an area of Arkansas that wasn't very far from where I grew up. So he was kind of one of those people. He was kind of a mountain person anyway. So it kind of appealed to her too. But she was 100% on board with it as soon as I suggested it.
So, and I want to take a minute on your background because what's really interesting is you had the skill set. Like this was not new to you. Like
No.
and when we were talking in the kind of virtual green room, you were talking about the background you came from, which was very much uh, rural, if I'm correct, right? A lot of the
Mhm.
skills, doing things with less, um, and your first experience didn't work out well. So talk about that little first experience.
We had a camper trailer, and we found 20 acres. It was owner financed, and we talked a moving company into moving the camper down there because it's so remote that you can't just it it was a process to get the camper in there, and we made it there for, I guess, about 2 years. Just
Wow.
Yeah,
So
so we
no electricity, no running. Would they have running water?
no we ended up setting up a water catchment system,
Wow.
and it's real hilly, so the water catchment was up the hill. So we had water pressure. Like when we would turn on a faucet, it was just like you were in, hooked to municipal water. But but it was something that we caught coming off of a bluff up above our house. Um,
Wow.
there was a cabin on site, a new cabin, but it wasn't finished. So we lived in the camper until we got the cabin where we could live in it.
And did you end up moving into the cabin?
Yes, we did.
Okay.
And it was much easier to keep to keep warm in the winter time than the camper trailer was. So it
And
was
you weren't a parent at that point, right? It was just you two.
no, just the two of us. Right.
Wow.
I'm still curious what that conversation looked like, though, when you first kind of got this in your head, like, I'm tired of the rat race. I want to go off the grid. And you went and talked to your wife. Like, what did that conversation look like?
It was pretty much, she was on board with it. I mean,
You think
I
she
had
understood, like, the fullness of that, like, really being off the grid? Or the reality of it?
I don't think the reality of it, I don't think that really set in until we were actually there, like the first night or whatever. And then, I mean, it's the reality is that it's pretty dangerous to be on your own like that. And
right. Everybody who thinks when the poop hits the fan that they're going to like go off into the woods, and you don't just do that. And it's funny as you're talking about the conversation, Marya, I'm thinking you'd probably have a better chance of convincing Lou of doing that than I would convincing Kim.
Yes, yeah, he'd be all for it.
I would have the off-grid wing of the house. She'd be like, fine, we'll unhook your half. So Richard, let's jump right in. So if someone's having that conversation with their spouse, or they're alone, whatever, right? A lot of our listeners are potentially coming out of divorce or something and reinventing themselves. And like, what's the first consideration? Like, and it could be from a mistake you made, or this time around doing it the right way.
Well, I think you want to, there's a lot of definitions of off-grid, and, it may be, in my case, it was a little cabin in the woods, but I mean, I know people who have like a regular house, but it's off-grid, and, you have to determine how far into this that you're going to go. And if you're going into it with someone else, you need to make sure that they're okay with that too. Like you said, you might just end up having an off-grid wing of the house.
Right.
But,
So if someone were doing that, if someone were defining what off-grid is, where's a good way to get information for that? Because I would guess if you're not out like in the middle of nowhere, there's regulations and things in my guess is the more populated where you're at, the likelihood is there's more red tape. So it might be easier to live, but there's more red tape.
Right. Believe it or not, and I mean, I know people have aversions to social media, but like on Facebook, there's plenty of groups about living off grid. And that's one of the number one questions on all of the different groups that I'm in is, where can I do this? And, people can kind of point you in the right direction. I actually found my place from a newspaper ad. And there was a guy, he was advertising the property as a deer hunter special. And, I went and looked at it. There was like 160 acres. It was all divided up into 20-acre plots. And it actually turned out to be just perfect for what we wanted. But, I would definitely suggest checking out social media groups that deal with off-grid if you need to find a place to start.
Interesting. And when people are looking at doing that, is there any recommendations that you can give to really understand the differences? I think because people read it, and we were talking like before the show, right? We were talking about shows like Homestead Rescue and things that are out there where people see it and they see how hard it is, but they're separated from a screen. So what's a good way to determine what type of off the grid lifestyle is right for the person who's evaluating it?
If you were to, once you determine how far off the grid you want to go, you're basically going to have to put your feet on the property that you're considering moving to. You talked about like laws or like regulations. One of the things we did, we knew we were either going to live in Arkansas or we were going to live in Missouri. So we started looking through all of the different regulations, like what are you going to do for sewer? Because there's all sorts of regulations about that. And in some states, you have to have a certain amount of property just to put in your own septic system or whatever. There's that limits where you can move to if you want to move all the way off the grid, if that makes any sense.
What? No, and the interesting thing is, I think people gravitate to off grid, meaning homesteads, versus you could still be off grid and have a computer. Like, I think that that's where you hear that. It's almost like when we were talking earlier, like when I cut meat, a lot of meat out of my diet, people are like, "Oh, you're a vegetarian," and it's like, no, I'm just cutting meat out. So, to some degree, do you feel that people need to understand the definitions and what it means, as opposed to saying, it's someone else's definition?
Right. And to your point about gradually making the move instead of making instead of trying to do it all at one time, that's I would definitely recommend that.
Is that you think that's one of the lessons that you learned on the first go around?
That is definitely one of the lessons, because it was culture shock. The first night when the sun went down and the coyotes started howling, and I'm not even joking. One night it was a mountain lion that was screaming, and we had some goats at the time, and and then dogs start barking, and you find out it's because there's a rattlesnake on your front porch.
Wow.
So yeah, you don't want to have to figure everything out on the fly, and that's probably one of the reasons why we failed the first time. It's because we were trying to learn everything and trying to live at the same time.
So with that, once they've decided what that definition means, it seems like there's a lot of research. Is that part of the process that you recommend?
Right, because it's a big country, and some people are going to want to live in a warmer climate. Some people like the cooler climates, and you really have to look at what you want to do. If you want animals, there's a certain kind of property that you're going to need for animals. If you just want to hunt and fish, you're going to have to live in a different kind of area. Some places you can't catch your own water. There's a lot of water regulations. So,
yeah, and this is just purely a practical question. How would they catch you? Like, if you're like, hey, I've got, you're on 20 acres. Do they come out and like look and say, oh.
Yeah, you would be surprised. In some of the different places we've lived. When we moved back to Missouri, we were building a house, just a tiny house, and I had all of my stuff was delivered one day. I delivered it myself, but still, it was all brought in, and I had all my tools set up, and we were going to start building the next day. So I was just going to sleep in my truck. I've got a F-350. It's a crew cab, and I was just going to sleep in the back of it. And right after dark, a sheriff's deputy rolled up on me at full speed on my own property, and started tossing my stuff to find out why I was there.
Wow.
You would really be surprised. And that was all. That all started from a phone call that a neighbor that lived about half a mile away made a phone call, and
that's not very neighborly.
No, it was not. But armed men show up and demanding you get out of your truck. And
wow.
Yeah.
So as you're talking about the process, I like it, because it's funny I think every episode that we've done, Marya, is like, it's always thinking through and having a plan and executing. So it sounds like, step one is, what the hell does that mean? Right. And my guess is that even if the long view is what you're doing, like off the grid, homesteading, water catchment, raising animals, all that kind of stuff, that there can be sub points along the way where you're working toward that, like a fitness routine, where you're figuring out, okay, well, I'm going to start out doing this, right? And then, it sounds like the second step is really this research, right? Like,
right,
how do I do it? But I like what you said about the gradual part. And what are some of the steps people can take? And these are kind of sub steps, I would guess, to kind of gradually evaluate, one, their fitness to do it, but two, to really get an idea of what it's like. Because I hear you talk, and it's like, man, like that's ballsy. Like, I mean, that would be crazy enough doing it like for a weekend, like saying I'm going to spend 1 week there a month and doing that. You're talking about you guys picked up, moved out there, and that's it. Like sun went down, you're out there. So what are some gradual steps that people can take if they want to get to where you're looking at?
Well, believe it or not, I mean, we talked about research, but YouTube is your friend. Anything that you need to know, you're going to want to learn, how to take care of things for yourself. You can't just call a handyman to come fix your plumbing, when you live an hour and a half away from any town. It's hard enough just to find somebody, and then to get them to come out there is impossible. So you have to know what your skills are, and then what you're going to have to learn what you don't know that you need to learn, if that makes any sense. But
it does. And if somebody is totally devoid of skills, what do they do? Like, right? Like, I mean, I'm sure people are listening, or they'll listen to the replay and be like, all right, I want to do this, but I've never turned a wrench. I've never hammered a nail. I've never put in a screw.
Well, so if you have a support system, and even though we live out in the middle of this, I mean, it's a valley, and there's hardly anybody down in the valley. We made friends with a neighbor, really good neighbor. He had been living off grid for about 10 years at the point where we moved in, and he really helped us out. And just as we got to know other people who live in the area, if you need to lean on somebody, they're there for you. And I mean, some of the best people that we've met have been off grid, and they're really, they'll do whatever they can to help you out. And of course, we do whatever we can to help other people out as well.
How do you find that support group? I know you talked about Facebook, but heck, many people don't even want to date on social media and things like that. How do you find the people that are reputable, the people that really want to help you? I think I have seen, there's certain communities that I deal with in online, and you're like, wow, it's really just generally a community that likes helping people. But still, there's risk involved. How do you find the right people?
You knock on doors. Like, you just go meet your neighbors, or your neighbors come meet you. And
that's what I mean, how do you even find your neighbors? If you're on 20 acres and they're on 20 acres, like, you just wander around until you see another house?
It's funny, because in the valley we live in, even though my neighbor lives about a mile, give or take, from me, I could, anytime he started his truck, I could hear it because of the way the valley went. And anytime somebody was coming down the hill, I mean, they were still a mile away, but you could tell when somebody was coming. And, get ready. You can meet them at the road if you wanted to. Like, be ready for them when they came up to the driveway. And so we met a lot of people that way, just meeting them on the road, saying, hey, what's up, and introducing ourselves.
Do you oh no, go ahead, Marya.
No, that answers my question.
Well, my question was going to be, you're taking a lot of risk. I would think that you're gonna mesh well with those neighbors.
Yeah, you have to have. That's one of the skill sets you have to have. I mean, you have to be a good person if you're going to try to attract good people. And not all the people I met were good. There were some that I had to tell to leave and never come back. But and we just avoided each other. But you have to be a good neighbor if you want good neighbors.
So now they've well, you know what? Right now, I think is a good time to go to commercial. We're going to go to commercial. It sounds like we've kind of hit the first three, but we'll do a recap when we get back and talk a little bit about the last steps and the big mistakes that people can make. All right, and we are back with Getting Started.Life, the show that helps you with new endeavors and new things. For those just joining us, our guest is Richard Gray, and today we're talking about living off the grid and what do you do if you want to start living off the grid. And to recap, we talked a little bit in the beginning of the show about the first couple of steps, which sounds like, and correct me if I'm wrong, figure out what the heck it means to live off grid, because there's a lot of definitions, do a heck of a lot of research, and build a support group.
Right.
All right. So now people have figured all this out. They're like, all right, we're ready to go in some way, shape, or form. What do you suggest they do next?
You're going to have to figure out how you're going to fund all of this. Like,
that was my
how you
next question.
yeah, you're going to have to, pay for all of this. And the bills don't stop just because you move off grid. I guess if you moved far enough off grid, you might be able to dodge the bills for a while. But I mean, eventually, you have to pay the bills, and if nothing else, you have to pay taxes on the property that you moved to. So
I'm thinking that ultimately, again, it's a lot of research. But in your experience, what's a realistic budget to move a family off grid to kind of what you did?
Honestly, it would depend. I mean, if you're going to be running generators, of course, it's going to cost more. If you're just if you're going to live very minimally, I mean, we've done the math on it, and I mean, if you didn't have to buy any fuel or try to do keep up the maintenance on generators, things like that. Like the bare minimum for us would be like $1,000 a month that you would need just to keep your head above the water. But once you start adding in like generators and the fuel for that, or propane for cooking or heating or whatever, I mean, the numbers just keep going up and up and up there. And
what did you when you had your first go around, and it sounded like you moved back partly to have kids, but partly because things didn't work out. Were you working a regular job at that time, or did you leave everything?
I was not. Jennifer, she was working a full-time job at I say local hospital. It was, I don't know, 45 miles away, but she was doing that, and I was trying to make our cabin livable.
Wow. So even
animals.
with a supplemental income, you had issues.
Oh yeah.
Wow. So that's really interesting. So what would you say? And I'm guessing, frankly, if you wanted to try and live less on the grid, but in an area that's more populated, it's still going to be expensive. Because I think you think, again, water collection, you think non-standard power, and all that crap's really like solar panels are really expensive, even if you do some kind of weird financing thing.
Right. So yeah, we had thought about solar. It's expensive, and you need sunlight, and we're down in the valley, and it's heavily wooded, so that wasn't really going to work out for us. I can see where for a lot of people solar would work out, but if you want to have the the luxuries that you have in a normal house, I mean, you're talking $12,000-$15,000 worth of solar and batteries that you would have to have.
Right. Well, and all the solar panels that you see, like in more densely populated suburban areas and stuff like that, a lot of those are heavily subsidized by power companies, and you're not getting to use them yourself. So when you're talking about putting in a power system, it ain't cheap.
No, it's not. It was prohibitive for us. The price of it was prohibitive, so we couldn't do that. But what we found was we used less. I mean, we ran some fans and some lights, and we were good with that.
So do you run off a generator?
We did not. We have since, as we've been slowly getting ready to do this again, we've acquired a couple of different generators. Some that are really fuel efficient, some that aren't. But this time around, we wanted to have that because, having a refrigerator is nice. So we decided we would go that route this time.
Beef jerky only goes so far.
Well, that's funny. We're actually vegetarians. So that made it a little easier for us, actually, because I mean, really a refrigerator is a nice luxury for us. We don't have to have it. I mean, we're not keeping meat, so eggs from the chickens, they'll last a couple of months, as long as you don't wash them. So
Yeah, so it's a show where you can actually dip them in some kind of oil or something, and it makes them last almost forever.
Mineral oil, you can do that, or you could put it in lime water, I think. But if you just leave them out you can leave them out on the kitchen table for a month or so. They'll be fine.
Wow.
Yeah, but
I'm curious. The image of going off grid is like homesteading, right? Like out on 20 acres in the middle of nowhere. But theoretically, what would prevent me from taking my house off grid?
Probably just whatever the local regulations are for that. I'm not sure that a lot of places.
I'm on well, so septic and well already. So I would need a power source, and in theory, even though I'm in a subdivision, I've got an acre and a half. I could grow my own vegetables.
Right.
So I don't necessarily have to go and buy, acreage somewhere to kind of get the same independence or lack of dependence, which I think are different things, on the grid, right?
Right. I think that goes back to, defining what off-grid means, what off-grid means to you. We've lived in subdivisions. We lived in a gated townhouse community at one point. So we thought that part of being off-grid for us was being out away from other people. So that's the route.
So you're like, you went off the social grid too. And I think kind of going back to one of the early steps, it's what grids are you off of, right? Like,
right.
And understanding that it's not this monolithic term. And what's interesting is when you're talking about regulations, like I was really into researching these. I don't know what they call them now. They were calling them like something. God, I can't remember. They basically there's a community that would build these homes, and they would start with like tires, and it was this heating system where they would build it with southern exposure, and then basically
earth ships.
Yes, earth ships.
Right.
There you go. But they were building these communities, and like the power companies and like the water utilities were like, as far as I read the articles I read, they were kind of in cahoots with local government to say that they can't do that. And their rationale was it's unsafe. Like people have kids and stuff, and what's more dependable than the power grid, right? It's like people in Texas and California have had a lot of brownouts and stuff, in the past. So probably like a lot is wrong. So it was interesting where the regulations came from, because they seemed terrified of successful removal from the grid in many ways. And now these earth ships are like, they're really nice. Like the first ones I saw were like, they kind of look like something out of Mad Max, but now they're building them and they're really, really cool.
Yeah.
They were cool in Mad Max too. Let's be honest. They were pretty cool in Mad Max.
They would be really cool. Yes. But, and it was interesting. Actually, one of the things, and it's totally off conversation, but like one of these, like they built the first prototypes, and the heating system, which again was just catching heat in these tires and then releasing it during the day. It was so powerful. They were in, I think, New Mexico or something like that. It was so efficient that it was like melting computers. Like it was so hot that they couldn't modulate it, and they had to kind of go back and figure some of the stuff out. But it is interesting that what local regulations are. Like when I lived in Oak Park, highly, highly dense suburb, you could have chickens. Here in Trout Valley, you can't have chickens. And I'm on an acre and a third, right? So it is weird. And I think that goes back to the research side of it. But it's so the budgetary side, I kind of want to go back to that, because what would be a realistic budget? Like what could someone expect that first year of spending? And then going from that on, because I know some homesteaders and off the grid people also plan on leaving their current job and moving into what might be a side hustle or doing something like that to generate income.
Yeah, you're definitely going to have some side hustles. And I wouldn't limit myself to just one. When I first went living off grid, I worked as a Um, I worked for a company that took um, they took properties that banks had foreclosed on and that still needed maintenance. So I drove around Arkansas, all over Arkansas, just doing odd jobs at these houses. Mow a yard here, hang a door somewhere else, and that kind of helped me get some of the skills I was going to need to, to work on our cabin. But there's all sorts of, I see people who work online to try to make a source of income. Where we're at, that doesn't really work for us because there's no cell reception. So you have to take all that into account. How are you going to be employed? What are you going to do to make that money? That's all going to have to work into where you decide that you're going to do this.
Well, and a lot of times, again, on some of the shows I watch and stuff, people don't think of that, and they work off their savings. And that only lasts so far. So what could someone expect from if they do something like you, like total off the grid, what could they expect for a cost for the first year?
It's really going to depend on the person, what level of comfort they want to have. The property we bought, part of the reason why we were able to get it is because it was so remote. It made the price on it affordable for us. But still you're paying $400 or $500 a month for the property, and then you still have things like the maintenance on your vehicle, or what kind of food you're going to eat. It's really going to depend on the person. But for us as two people, we were probably still spending, $1,000 a month just to survive there. It's
wow.
Yeah, it's not like it just became, that we didn't have any bills to pay or whatever. And we live very frugally. We don't drive new vehicles. We don't have car payments, that kind of thing. So
right. Now, did you grow all your own food? Or a good bit of it?
We attempted to that time, but it's all virgin land, so there was no soil.
Wow.
The Ozarks it's a very rocky place. So we were hitting people up to get manure out of their horse barns and things like that, trying to build the soil up. And up until that point, we had no experience ourselves, like gardening or doing any of that. So that was a learning curve. You should have seen our garden this year. We've got probably, I don't know, a quarter of an acre out there that we do. We built a greenhouse this year.
Wow.
So that we could start the seeds on the inside. We have 30 chickens.
Wow.
Yeah.
Now, do you also do food preservation, like canning and things like that?
We've tried a few different ways. We haven't got into canning yet. What we've done the most of is freezing and drying. And you'd be surprised how much you can dry. And again, we don't eat meat. But like the things out of the garden, we've made all sorts of like basil salt. We've got I don't know. We actually had like fresh tomatoes into the end of December.
Wow.
Yeah. It's amazing how long things will last. Like
now,
that.
So let's finish up the steps, because I have some other questions but I want to make sure we get that. So you figuring out what it is, doing the research, building the support network, figuring out the budget. What's next?
Next is just find the place and get in there and start doing it.
Now, did you finance yours or did you buy it straight out?
No, actually, yeah, we actually got a pretty good deal on it, and it's owner financed. So, it was, pretty good deal on it. But again, it's because it's, in a valley in the middle of nowhere, but.
Very interesting. So now that the listeners can kind of figure out what their steps are you, and we'll go to the biggest mistake in a bit, but what as we've been talking through, what's making me think is the first time you did it was you and your wife. Whole different calculus. Now you have 3 kids, young kids, right?
Right.
So you're more in there's more at stake. There's more cost. Like, how are you looking at it different this time?
Well, again, we lucked out. The kids are behind it 100%. My kids, we homeschool. My kids are usually outside from 7 o'clock in the morning until we make them come in at night. They love being outside. They're rolling around in the mud, that kind of thing. And honestly, just about every day I wake up, the kids are talking about moving back to the cabin. So
That's awesome.
we made another attempt at this when my 2 older kids, when they were much younger.
Oh, so this is the 3rd one.
Oh, this will be the 3rd time. Yeah.
It's cool though that you talk about that. I want to take a minute and say that, because I think people, especially with what we do on the show, talking about new things, I think people look at it and say, I started, I failed, I'm done with it. And they don't look at like, what step did they fail at potentially? And I hate to even use the term fail. I think not succeed is better, because I think people give up too easily on stuff like this.
Yeah. I would agree with you there, but if it's something that you really want to do, get in there and do it.
But what about like other considerations, right? So I used to have a second home in Michigan that it wasn't remote, but what was remote was things like healthcare. And in when I lived in Oak Park, which is a small suburb or it's actually not that small, but a suburb outside of Chicago, I was 3 blocks from the fire station. So there's paramedic and fire, and everything was right there. Where I was in Michigan, it was a longer ride. So I thought, what happens if my kid falls and, cuts an artery, or something happens, or, you're dealing with something that needs immediate, like, how do people square that up when they're looking at doing something like you're doing?
All right. That's a good question. I'm all about self-reliance. I want to be personally responsible for myself, for my kids, that kind of thing. Where our cabin is right now, there's no fire service. I had somebody actually took a shot at the cabin one time, and the bullet came into the cabin. I couldn't even get the police to come out. Like, the sheriff's department made me go into town to file a report on that.
Wait, someone shot at your cabin?
Yeah, I don't think they realized it was occupied. And but yeah, and when I called I had to drive about a mile to get a cell signal, and when I got a hold of the police, they asked me how many shots were fired, and I said, well, I think just the one. And they said, well, it was probably an accident, and they probably stopped when they heard you start screaming. So
wow.
They didn't even want to take a report. I had to drive all the way into town. It was like 40 miles to get there.
Wow.
But so there are ways, though, to take care of that, to be personally responsible for that. There is a fire department up there, but it's a subscription-based service. So you pay the fire department at the beginning of the year, and if you have a fire, they come out and put your fire out. If you don't pay them, they'll come out and watch your place burn.
That's a subscription you want on auto pay.
Right.
Wow.
And like where we're at, you couldn't get an ambulance in there if you tried. But what they do offer is a subscription service to a life flight helicopter. So, there's a designated area up the road a little bit. And, if you have a problem and you're part of this subscription service, you can call them up and they can fly a helicopter out and take you, to where you need to go. I imagine that airplane ride or helicopter ride would still be expensive for you, but at least they would come out and get you.
Well, but it also makes me think, when you're talking about budget and skill set and all that kind of stuff, if it's just you, hey, it is what it is. Something happens.
Right.
But all of a sudden, when you're the one responsible for the safety and security and health of more than just yourself. Steps 1 through 4 become very different, right? Budgetarily, you should have on hand things that are essential to immediate first aid, right? Like, you should have on hand certain things that are important for dealing with these unplanned things that can pop up. And I would guess with kids, even though they're running around and stuff, boredom, like things, one thing that as you were talking in the beginning, I'm like, well, crap. Like people say they can do, like, what is it? Their Earth Day, people turn the crap off and they're like, oh, okay, I'm going to be without a screen. That's like 10 minutes or whatever, an hour, and then all of a sudden it's like, okay, what about really without a screen? And I think even the suburban off the grid people don't realize that if the dependency of stuff fails, you may end up with issues where, power's not on and dealing with that. So I think it brings a whole host of things that people might not consider.
Right. I would not want to move off grid with some teenagers who weren't on board with this. I mean, that would be horrific. I could only imagine that, because they're not going to see their friends and they don't have their screen time, that kind of thing. But I've been lucky with my kids. My kids would rather be out in the woods than inside the house.
That's awesome. So what's the biggest mistake? I mean, I think we've touched on some of them. And I'm really interested to hear this one, because again, you're on your third try. And I think that's like awesome that adversity doesn't deter your desire to have that dream of being off grid. But what would you say is the biggest mistake people make?
The not thinking about how you're going to pay for this. That was our biggest mistake each time that we did it. We just underestimated how much money it would take, how long it would take to set up another revenue stream, that kind of thing. We think we've got it figured out this time. We hope we do. And we're going to spend a month transitioning from here to there, which is going to help too. So
now, so a month, and are you able to go back and forth during that time? So what does that mean in transition? Like how long will you spend at each place?
So, I mean, you can imagine I have 3 kids and we have a lot of stuff. So we have to go through a lot of the stuff and downsize and then start moving it. We have some family that live even further south than that, and they're going to set us up with a place that we can kind of use as a base camp. It's closer to the place than we are now.
Now, are you still leaving like a plan B in place for like, if things don't work, right? Like, I mean, ultimately it sounds like both times you were kind of all in. You were lucky enough to be able to pick up where you left off in your vocation and things like that. But do you have a plan B, or is this like, nope, I'm doing it?
This time it's more, nope, we're doing it. It's not really so much that, I guess it's more circumstances have put us in that situation right now with the pandemic. So it's pretty much sink or swim at this point. But
right.
But I mean, there's always a plan B that, I know where I could go back to work if I needed to, that kind of thing.
Right.
So
right.
I wouldn't want to not have a plan B or a plan C. And I'm always joking because I've pretty much always have 5 backup plans going on at any time. So.
Well, and I think that there is and one of the steps wasn't this, but I think figuring out psychologically whether you're cut out for it, right? Like, I think it is romanticized, and I look at it, I'm like, man, I would love to do that. But, 5 years in the Army and 4 years at the academy, absolutely. Like, I won't tent camp anymore. I'm like, I freaking hate it. I don't like being cold. I don't like being wet. I don't like being hungry. Now that could change, I think, but I kind of look at it and say, boy, I really have to evaluate stuff. Not that I can't do any of that stuff. I just don't know how much I like it anymore, and right. And I think that psychology piece, it's not like something like when I bought a motorcycle, I'm like, I'm going to love it. And I just didn't love it. Like it was always too cold or too hot. And, it was a lot of maintenance. I'm like, that wasn't as fun as I thought. So I ended up selling a motorcycle. That's a lot easier than selling a homestead and then deciding, okay, I'm going to go back. Like it's, you got to figure out, I would guess, if it's the right thing for you.
Right. And you mentioned camping and things. So yeah, camping, I can see where somebody could be really good at camping, really enjoy it, and then just hate living off grid. I could definitely see that because, it's a totally different thing to do it for a weekend, but day in and day out when the temperature is below 0 degrees Fahrenheit. And the only way that you stay warm is if you have cut enough wood to, to keep a fire going in the wood stove. It gets pretty monotonous, and it's not a whole lot of not a whole lot of fun. It's
well, it's interesting. So that would bring up my probably my last question is, what compels you like to do it? Like, I totally get it. Like, I know why I would, but what compels you to do it when it's like hard, it's not fun? Like, there's so many things where I'm like, wow, that's like swimming upstream right where Niagara Falls goes over, that amount of like current. Like, what brings you to it?
I think it's the personal responsibility part. I like doing things for myself. And the older I get, I find it harder to do things that other people tell me to do. So I'd rather work for myself. I'd rather work for myself, And,
right.
And if that means I have to, figure out how to run a chainsaw, how to sharpen the cutting chain on it, so be it. That's what I do. And
apparently that's the most dangerous tool. Like, I was watching, I think, This Old House, and they're like, more chainsaw injuries than any other tool.
The worst cut I ever got was from a chainsaw, and it wasn't even running. It fell off of a bench, and I reached for it to try to keep it from falling, and I grabbed it by the chain, and that was the worst. Yeah,
well,
probably.
but it also, then you think about like a chainsaw injury somewhere where they can't get a ambulance into. I mean, you can bleed out in minutes. So,
or the tree falls on you, or whatever.
So, great show. I really, really appreciate you being on. You had talked about one. I think there's a couple of Facebook groups and things that you were involved with or that you run. Well, one, if people have questions, can they get hold of you? And how can they get hold of you?
Yeah, we do have a Facebook page that we just kind of keep our friends and other people in our circle. We kind of keep them up to date on what we do. It's a very unimaginative title. It's just called The Gray Homestead on Facebook. That would be
that's not false advertising, right?
Right. So yeah, I mean, you could keep up with us that way. And then we have a page where we just kind of share homesteading links, that kind of thing. And we call it the Ozark Homesteader. So you can find it on Facebook just by looking for the Ozark Homesteader.
The Ozark Homestead and the Gray Homestead.
The Ozark Homesteader.
Oh, Homesteader. Okay.
And then and then the Gray Homestead. And
awesome.
You can keep up, and you can see if we're going to make it this time, or if there's going to be a fourth try.
I was going to say there's got to be some kind of Patreon setup that you can do there to get people donating to you.
Well, we might. We dabble around too. I make decals and T-shirts too, not just for ourselves, but I've had some people who were gracious enough to kind of take me under their wing and support me learning how to do that.
Now, can you do that from your homestead?
We're trying to get that to work. If not, we can do it from my family's location. So
got it. So
if we have to do it once a month or once a week or whatever, but we still haven't figured out the logistics of that yet.
Awesome. Well, thanks again. This one went longer than a lot. And again, Richard Gray, homesteader, off the grid expert. Thanks for being on the show. You've been listening to Getting Started.Life, a show that teaches you how to start down new endeavors, the mistakes to avoid. And if you've got something you want to know about starting, reach out to us. We'll find the expert. We'll get it on. Or if you've got something you want to share, we would love to have you on the show, assuming, of course, it's tasteful and all that stuff. But we'd love to have you on. We're on every other Tuesday, so we'll talk to you in 2 weeks. Again, thanks for listening, and look for us in 2 weeks.